Specifically, this video is about three people. One of them was a priest from Austria, the other person was a British official, and the third person was a muezzin in a mosque. Is a person who calls the faithful to prayer in a mosque. I'm sure you're wondering, how could an Austrian priest or a British official, or least of all, a muezzin working in a mosque, have had anything to do with a movement for the restoration of the Ram temple that was destroyed by Babur, over which Babur had built the Babri mosque? Well, here's the story for you. An Austrian priest, a Jesuit priest, came to India sometime in the 18th century. He came in the middle of the 18th century. His name was Joseph Tiefenthaler, and he went around the country for close to 20 years. One of the places he visited was Awadh, that is Ayodhya. And after his extensive travels across the country, he wrote a book in Latin. And in that book, he provided a description of the Babri Masjid which he visited. He had seen the Babri Masjid from inside. And what had he seen there? This account Tiefenthaler wrote circa 1770. His account said that inside the masjid there were 12 pillars that supported the interior arcades of the mosque, and these pillars had all been taken from the Ram temple that had stood there and that was broken down. But there was more to it than that. We have all heard of pillars, of inscriptions, of stuff that archaeologists have found beneath the mosque. But Tiefenthaler threw a complete surprise, at least for the modern generation, people in the 20th century and people in the 21st century like you and me. Tiefenthaler wrote that inside the mosque there was a Bedi or a Vedi or a cradle that depicted the Janmasthan or birthplace of Lord Ram. Yes, you heard it correctly. This is inside the mosque. And he gave the specifications of that cradle. It was 18 feet in length and 15 feet in width and 5 feet tall. And he wrote that Hindus come and circumambulate the Bedi. By circumambulate, I mean they do pradakshina around the Bedi. This is not outside the mosque. This is inside the mosque. This was in the year 1770. In the 1850s, there were a couple of major riots between Hindus and Muslims for possession of the structure. It was already a disputed structure by then, and the Hindus called it the Janmasthan, and the Muslims said no, it was a mosque built by Babur. In 1855, there was a major riot, and a number of Hindus and Muslims unfortunately died in that riot. And 3 years later, there was another major riot. Who had caused this riot? It wasn't a Hindu or a Muslim. This violence was caused by a group of Nihang Sikhs. These were Sikhs. They went inside the Janmasthan and put up a flag inside the Janmasthan and did pradakshina around the temple, the cradle of Lord Ram, and violence broke out. After that, the British actually sealed the place. And it was after that cradle that was inside was no longer accessible to the Hindus. What happened in its place? And this is where the second person in this narrative comes in. A British official called P. Carnegie. P. Carnegie was a settlement officer in Faizabad district, which is now the Ayodhya district or Prayag district as they call it. So P. Carnegie actually went to the site and he recorded what had happened. There had been a history of violence. The British locked up the place. The Hindus built a chabutra, that is within the Babri Masjid complex but outside the mosque. So they built their chabutra outside the mosque and started praying there. And Carnegie wrote that up until then, Hindus had been worshipping inside the mosque. So while Muslims would worship once in a while, Hindus would regularly go there and worship the cradle that stood very much inside the mosque. Carnegie wrote this around 1870. It was in the 1860s that he was settlement officer in Faizabad district, and he wrote the whole history of the dispute and of what had happened A very interesting thing that happened in the meanwhile between Carnegie's recording and the earlier recording by Stephen Taylor, when the riot actually happened in 1858, the muezzin of the Babri Masjid, his name was Mir Khatib. Mir Khatib said in his complaint that the Sikhs came inside where the Janmasthan was and tried to take over the place. So Mir Khatib in his complaint uses the word Janmasthan. These three pieces of evidence turned out to be clinchers in the case when it was fought first in the Allahabad High Court and then in the Supreme Court of India. Because one of the principal arguments made by the Muslim side was that an idol of Ram Lalla was kept inside the mosque premises in the year 1949, and that is how suddenly the Hindus started making the claim that this was a temple and this was a Janmabhoomi and this was a Janmasthan. Before that there was nothing. So then the Hindu side presented a number of British gazetteers which mentioned various details. But then the Muslim side said all this is not enough. It's the British officials who have written it. They wrote it too late. Give us an account from 1528, the year in which you are saying that Babur demolished the temple. Of course there is no account from the year 1528 because Babur's diary is very strange. Babur wrote his diary when he was in Hindustan, and when he went to Ayodhya, his diary stops at March 1528 when he enters Ayodhya, and then pages of the diary have completely disappeared. How they disappeared, who made them disappear, whether they disappeared by accident or was it a deliberate thing, nobody knows that. But those pages have disappeared, and then the diary comes back to us only after Babur has left Ayodhya. So we do not know what has happened in Ayodhya. But it was a British official who wrote that there was an inscription inside the masjid when it stood there, again in the 1850s, that Mir Baki, one of Babur's generals, was ordered by Babur to build this mosque, and this inscription stood inside the masjid. And this mosque stood on the site of the Janmasthan. So the Muslim side did not accept these inscriptions, the pillars. They said it was all artificial, it had been deliberately manufactured, all of this evidence. So these three written accounts turned out to be very critical, because the Muslim side kept on saying, tell us something before the 20th century, tell us something. When the 19th century records were produced, they said tell us something before the 19th century. So the 18th century account of Stephen Taylor is actually the first account that says that the Hindus were actually worshipping inside the masjid structure. And then came Carnegie's account, which said that the Hindus continued to worship inside the masjid structure and the cradle was inside the masjid until the year 1858, when the British officials arbitrarily removed the Hindus from the site and the Hindus built a chabutra outside and the masjid stood on its own. And of course comes the mosque officials' own reference to the place as Janmasthan. These pieces were critical because it was essential to establish that the Hindus had a claim to the structure prior to 1949 and prior to some of the late 19th century British gazetteers, and these were clinchers. The Muslim side, on the other hand, could not produce any evidence of exclusive possession of the site, and this weighed heavily on the minds of the Supreme Court judges when they decided the case. The whole point was about exclusive possession. So what Stephen Taylor's account proved and Carnegie's account proved and also the muezzin's account proved was that at no point had Hindus given up their claim on the site and in fact were worshipping inside the masjid. The Muslim side, on the other hand, could not prove any exclusive possession. At no point was there a reality between 1528 and 1858 when the Hindus were actually evicted from the site, that the Hindus were not claiming the site. They were very well inside. They would go regularly and pray inside, and the cradle stood inside. This is a very little known fact and not only establishes that contemporary travelers, contemporary officials and others had seen not only inscriptions but also the cradle inside. It actually helped to identify the exact spot where Ram was born. Why is this important? Because in Ayodhya itself, there are claims that Ram was born here, there, in various such places. And one of the arguments made by the Marxist historians and by the Muslim side was that Janmasthan does not necessarily mean Janmabhumi. It may be elsewhere in Ayodhya. But Stephen Thaler's account, this account by a Jesuit priest, proved and established that this indeed is the Janmabhumi, the Janmasthan. And that is how this clinching evidence helped to establish the Hindu case that the Ram temple ought to come up at this exact spot. This spot which has been sacred to the Hindus for centuries, if not an even greater period. So as the Ram temple comes to fruition and the Ram temple is built in Ayodhya, has been constructed in Ayodhya, it is important to remember the contributions of these three people in this whole dispute. Stephen Thaler would not have known that 3 or 4 centuries after his death, his account would be used in this dispute in this manner. Similarly, P. Carnegie is a forgotten man in India. Nobody knows about him. Settlement commissioner in Faizabad, but he played a critical role in this dispute. And of course, the mosque official. While we take account of this dispute and also of the opening of the Ram temple, finally in the year 2024, let us remember a Jesuit priest from Austria who actually helped the Hindus to establish his case. That is why written records are very, very important. And the European habit of writing down things has turned out to be so useful. In this case, not only for the Europeans, but also for the Hindus and for the larger Indian population. Thank you so much. If you like this video, do press the like button. If you still haven't subscribed to my channel, do subscribe. See you soon. Thanks.